The first place to start, actually, I really believe, is looking at the shame piece. I'll say to people, how many times have you said to yourself that from this moment onwards, you're going to do it differently with your eating? And you've meant it. You've meant it with every cell in your body when you said it. And people will go hundreds, thousands, every single day, whatever they say, right? And then, of course, they don't. It all falls apart at some point. So they cannot understand, why can I not do this one thing that for some people, it's like what I want more than anything else in the world, and I can't do it, even though I want it so much. And then there's only one conclusion the brain can come to. Well, it's just because there's something wrong with me. I'm broken. And when we're in so much shame, we can't find any self-compassion. And the compassion piece is so important because compassion, it cools down emotional reactivity.
I wouldn't say a lot of compassion for my emotional self, but I understood at some point that I was being really hard on myself. And when I was talking about the nervous system sense of homeostasis and what it's trying to do, essentially, and you use the word, Steph, safety, that's what it's looking for. It's trying to make everything safe. But the brain, on the other hand, is also saying what you want, nervous system, is not safe, because I live in a world where there's a lot of pressure to look a certain way, and I might face discrimination if I let my body grow. And I'm not okay with that. Like, that's not safety to me. So we do have to consider the safety of other parts of us besides the nervous system that are competing with the safety of the nervous system in order to feel ready enough, I think, to take that on, because it will be uncomfortable and it will feel unsafe to some degree. If it's too unsafe, it becomes traumatic. And then we become more hopeless when we try it and we feel completely overwhelmed with it. It's not feeling safe at all. So that's important too, is to understand the level of safety we have and to build that through support and through connection and through education of what's going on, so that the shame's not also further convincing us of our lack of safety. So there's a lot of readiness involved in getting there.
Welcome to the Feminist Wellbeing Podcast. It's Beyond the Food. I'm Stefanie Daudier, your host, non-diet nutritionist, cognitive behavior coach, and founder of the Non-Diet Coaching Certification. And I want to talk to you about the interview of today. Today, we're going to give you probably one of the most profound interview I have recorded in the last 7.5 years of podcasting. It's a topic that I've been talking about, binge eating, in many, many episodes, but I've never done a specific interview breaking down binge eating from top to bottom. And this is what we're going to do together as a team. I've invited to guide us through this journey of understanding what is binge eating, not what we're told what binge eating is by mainstream media or diet culture or wellness culture, actually what it is. So I've invited 2 expert guests, Sarah Dozange, also known as the binge eating therapist on Instagram. Sarah is a therapist. She's an author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating, and she specialized in binge eating from a cognitive, emotional trauma perspective. And my second guest, which is also the co-host of Sarah in a podcast that some of you may be listening to. If you don't, highly recommend you do. It's called the Life After Diets podcast. So the co-host and the second expert on this topic is Stefanie Michel from I am Stefanie Michel on Instagram. She's a coach. She specializes in disordered eating recovery, body image, and well-being. So she's aligned with me when we're talking about health. And she's also a somatic and nervous system regulation expert. And me and Stefanie, we've met each other on Instagram 5 or 6 years ago, and we have been in each other's life via this beautiful platform that is Instagram since then. We've seen each other evolution. We have conversed with each other about different topics so many times. And I'm so happy to have her on the podcast and to introduce you to her and her partner, Sarah. on this very important conversation around binge eating. And I would invite you, even if you are not identifying as someone who has had in the past binge eating episode or currently no longer have, but to understand the behind the scene, because it's going to explain so many other aspects of your relationship to food, to body, and to health on how we're going to explain it to you. So without any further ado, my team is going to roll in the interview. I hope it serves you well, and I'll see you on the next podcast. Welcome to the show, Sarah and Stephanie.
Thank you.
Hi,
Thanks for
Stephanie.
having us.
For people to know, I have been following both of those ladies, and they've been following me on social media for years. This is a big event in the Trees of Us life. We're meeting for the first time face-to-face as much as Zoom can handle it. So I'm very excited to record this podcast. So for the purpose of our audience, would you like to quickly introduce yourself, both of you?
Sure. I am also Stephanie.
I know.
And it might get a little confusing. But I am a binge recovery coach, an intuitive eating certified counselor, and a body image coach, and currently working on somatic experiencing practicing too. So I help people recover from binge restrict cycles, especially, and deal with body image issues from trauma and associated emotional distresses.
And I'm Sarah Dosanjh. I'm here in the UK and I'm a psychotherapist and I co-host a podcast with Stephanie. That's how we know each other. And binge eating, that's my passion. So I'm very excited that we're going to be talking about compulsive eating and binge eating today. Stephanie, good topic choice.
I know. And it's Life After Diets is your podcast. For anybody listening to that, you can swap over to that podcast. And you've been running it for a couple of years, right?
That's right. And you're going to be coming on it soon too. So
I know.
people want to come and hear you being interviewed by us. Come check us out as well.
Okay, so let's dive right into compulsive eating. And I want to hear your definition of compulsive eating based on your journey and also your client/patient.
Should I quickly just define it? Because I think sometimes people get a bit confused with impulsive eating and compulsive eating. And impulsive eating is when you eat without forethought. So you don't think about it, you don't stop to consider, you have it. And I think all of us can relate to impulsively grabbing something to eat because it's available and it's offered. Whereas compulsive is like a different beast. You feel like you are acting against your own will. It feels like you're not making the choice. It's that loss of control. And so regardless of whether it's a big binge or it's a smaller amount of food, both can be really distressing because it doesn't feel like it's you making the choices. And that, I think, is the bit that most people struggle with, that and body image around this problem.
So is compulsive eating the same thing as binge eating?
I would say binge eating is a type of compulsive eating, and you could have compulsive eating that wasn't a binge. But I'm a big fan of just letting people use whatever language makes sense to you, because some people will say, I'm binging. And if a doctor spoke to them, they would say, or even a friend, they'd go, well, that's nothing. I eat that amount sometimes as well. And then they just feel completely invalidated by that. So I don't think it's so much about quantity, more that experience of it. So whether people say compulsive or binge eating, I think it can be pretty interchangeable as we're using it in everyday language.
And I think I know for me, my client type, also there's shame associated with either one of the term based on their background and their life journey. And people resist labeling it as one or the other because the shame that goes along with being labeled.
I agree. Compulsive eating as a term, whenever I hear it, reminds me of Janine Roth. Are you familiar with her?
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, who's not, right? She's the OG person who started talking about food, in this way. And she's got a book called what is it? How to Stop Compulsive Eating, or what's the title of it? I can't remember. This is the first time I identified, way back then, I was 20 years old, as a compulsive eater. And I do remember feeling some, I don't know if it's relief or like resonance with that idea of compulsive eating because no one else had talked about it before. And it was like, yeah, that's what it feels like. When you hear somebody describe what it feels like to the way that Sarah just said, like this against your will type of eating, it feels nice to feel like that there's a name for that. But in the years since, I feel like compulsive eating just does have a stigma, and it feels like you're just someone who doesn't have any control around food. And on the outside, I think that's what it looks like, and it's what it feels like. And it kind of offers this air of this lack of discipline, which speaks to character. And I think that's why shame comes into it, because it feels like a really, oh gosh, it's just really taboo to not have control and discipline around food. With binge eating, compulsive eating, however it's named, one of the things that I learned, and I've recovered from 25 years of that, was that it was reactionary. Like, it wasn't acting in a vacuum. Compulsive eating didn't exist because I was obsessed with food for food's sake. It was happening because I had shame around the fact that I had hunger and that I had an appetite, which was supposed to be smaller. And that shame in and of itself perpetuated this restriction, whether it was physical or mental, that created more urgency around the food itself. And this whole cycle just fed on itself, no pun intended. And it was more an issue of my own shame and restriction more than it was this compulsion. I feel like this focus on the compulsion ignores what's actually fueling the compulsion, which is more to the root of the issue.
I totally agree with you. And we can think about compulsion in other spheres than just food, right? Because we have other compulsion. I used to bite my nails, and that was a compulsion to deal with the anxiety that had nothing to do with food. It was about work, it was about relationships. So compulsion has more for me to do with a coping and a relief of something underneath. And I think that's when we are stuck in feeling ashamed, it's harder to look beyond to see what's feeding that compulsion of the binge eating. Would you agree with that?
Yes. We tend to focus on the food part or the biting the nails part instead of what's the source of all of that. Yeah.
When we understand addiction altogether, rooted in trauma, we can see that it's really not about the food or the nail. It's about what happened that caused that compulsion to be there.
Hunger itself is a compulsion. Like, hunger is to compel us to eat. So the problem is when we push hunger away, that compulsion grows till it's like a tsunami. So the majority, there is a study, I think it was at Yale actually, that showed that 2/3 of people who struggled with binge eating, they were looking at, which is a type of compulsive eating, it was preceded by a diet in 2/3 of cases. So they hadn't struggled with binge eating until they tried to control their appetite. There was a third of people for whom that isn't true. They tended to have more adverse childhood experiences. It tended to develop as a coping mechanism. So I think it's both. But even for those for whom binging or compulsive eating starts as a coping mechanism, the attempts to restrict and control, which are going to be at play, is like pouring petrol or gasoline, depending on where you're from, onto this feeling, and it's gonna ignite, which is why I'm not here saying, and I know Steph is not saying this either, that restriction is absolutely the only thing. Sort out restriction and everything will just be absolutely fine. But we have to start there first, because anything else is just going to keep getting disrupted by that.
And tell me if you agree with this. When I think about compulsion and coping behavior, I think, anyway, for me, it was because I was restricting that it's kind of guided my body to explore that avenue of compulsion with food. If I hadn't had dieted and had body image, it perhaps would have been other things, drugs, alcohol, and so forth. Do you see that as well?
I do. And I talk about that a lot because I have actually had clients who say, why can't it be alcohol? Why can't that be? I'd rather it be that, which is, it speaks to our fat phobia, I think. But I think that because where there is a scarcity of something, especially something that we need to survive, that's really read as a trauma in the body if we're not getting enough food for our appetite, or for our basic needs. Even if it's just a little bit less, that the body sort of understands that as a threat. So it's coding it. And it's like, oh, okay, this is an area where we need to put a lot of focus because that's threatening to me. So that's going to be the place where when there's vulnerability in the system or there's lack of homeostasis emotionally or physically, that we're going to go to that. That's going to be the thing we're going to go to first because that's the thing we need to secure the most. And that vulnerability, I think for people who have dieted, I've even seen it, not just levels of eating disorders, but just some version of disordered eating, that once that's coded, it doesn't uncode. The body is just really protective of its sustenance. It's a real threat to our, to thriving. So it's going to always read that as like, that's something to watch. That's something to watch. And that's why I think people, most of us have dieted at some point in our lives. So early on, potentially that gets coded by the body as something to move towards in times of vulnerability and remains that way. And we try our best to, make it go somewhere else. I think I used to come home and say, oh, let me just try to have a glass of wine first. Maybe I can, maybe I'll become addicted to something else. But no, it never worked because I already had the coding there.
I like this coding analogy because let's go into the nervous system into this, because to me, binge eating, either in the way that it's created or how we recover from it, compulsive eating or binge eating, to me is strongly tied to understanding compulsion/nervous system. So let's talk about the role of the nervous system in the creation and healing of that behavior.
I will pick up on that because that is my favorite thing to talk about these days. And it lends itself right into this coding conversation. Yes. So the nervous system is responsible for sort of monitoring our homeostasis. It's doing a lot of background work to keep our heart beating and to keep our, us breathing and to just manage all the different organs. And, and it's related to everything in our body that, we're not consciously even controlling. And as such, it's responsible for understanding what's off, or what are we not getting enough of? What are we getting too much of? How do we need to compensate for all of that so that we stay in balance? And again, with food, when we're not getting enough or when we have dieted and there's some kind of imbalance in that area, the body will increase our hunger to say, all right, we need more food, we need more food. And so there are things working here beyond our conscious awareness to keep food coming, but our consciousness is very intent on controlling that and of decreasing our body size. I know that, there's a little bit more movement towards diversity now, but certainly when I was growing up and, anybody here who, grew up in a time where you were supposed to shrink pretty much from anywhere you were, like just getting smaller was just better. And so a lot of us were pushing our bodies under our set points, where our body was designed to be and wanted to be to thrive. And that, for many people, is read by the nervous system as a problem. And the nervous system doesn't care that you want to be in a size whatever jeans. It's just, okay, we're just not getting enough food and there's an issue here. There's a lack of balance. We need to do things to figure that out and to make that better. And so it's going to increase those hunger signals. And we're interpreting that as, I'm so undisciplined, I have no self-control, I'm compulsive and all these things. And the shame builds, and then that's also read by the nervous system as a threat. So now we've got this criticism going on. We've got the not enough food coming in. The body's, what is going on? Like we seem to be under attack in some way, and it's going to keep pushing to fix it. But what it's trying to do to fix it is going against what our intellectual side, which, has a totally different agenda, is trying to do. So we're kind of fighting a losing battle. And I think that this element of shame comes in because we assume that's a personal responsibility thing, when actually we are up against things that have been developing for centuries and centuries. This is age old, the way our nervous system runs and works, and it's bigger than us. And yet we continue to try to control it. So there's a lot of, I think, reduction of shame to work on here when you understand the way the nervous system is actually kind of in charge of things and what it's doing and what it's trying to do, and that it isn't about your character. It's about the way you're built.
I just want people to understand that what we described earlier as compulsion is ignited by this nervous system as described by Stefanie. Like that out of control is a behavior ignited by that nervous system feeling extreme fear or unsafety. And that compulsion is uncontrollable. And it's for a reason to bring back that balance, that homeostasis. Is that a great way of recapping what you said?
That did it much faster than I did.
Well, exactly that, though it comes from a different part of the brain. And I think the most dangerous message out there from diet culture and wellness culture as well is that our appetite, this system, we should be able to execute top-down control of it. Like that is something that every human being is capable of, because it looks like, this is the confusing part for people, it looks like some people can do it, It's like, well, if they can do it, then it should be possible for everyone else. We don't know what's going on in their nervous systems. For whatever reason, it's not being read as a threat. However that is from a biochemistry, genetic perspective, experiences, who knows? And this assumption that we are all dealing with the same capacities in our brain, if you like. And it's humbling. I didn't want to accept this, Stefanie. I did not want to accept this. I fought and fought and fought against this truth because I didn't want it to be true.
I think for me too is because I was renowned, acknowledged, and gratified to be in control to the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
So admitting to myself, to my coach, to the people I was working with, and then later to the public that I was out of control was again back to the shame piece that I wasn't able to control. So let's talk about recovery. Let's talk about now that we understand how it's created and why it's created, what is the healing path?
I can start. The first place to start, actually, I really believe, is looking at the shame piece. Because the shame is not just an external message of you should be able to control it. This is an internalized experience. So sometimes I'll put it this way. I'll say to people, how many times have you said to yourself that from this moment onwards, you're going to do it differently with your eating? And you've meant it. You've meant it with every cell in your body when you said it. And people will go hundreds, thousands, every single day, whatever they say, right? And then, of course, they don't. It all falls apart at some point. So they cannot understand, why can I not do this one thing that for some people, it's like what I want more than anything else in the world, and I can't do it, even though I want it so much. And then there's only one conclusion the brain can come to. Well, it's just because there's something wrong with me. I'm broken. And for as long as we continue to believe that, I feel like Brené Brown talks about shame corrodes the very part of us that believes we're capable of change. And when we're in so much shame, we can't find any self-compassion. And the compassion piece is so important because compassion, it cools down emotional reactivity. Because when our brain is very emotional, our emotions are our threat. All of this is triggered off in our brain. The blood flow moves away from our prefrontal cortex and it goes into our lower brain. Our appetite's down there, our primal brain's down there. So now we're making these decisions. Doesn't feel like we're making decisions because we're not thinking them through, but the decisions are coming from our emotional and primal brain. That's when people often describe, I feel like it's not even me making a choice. I'm just getting up and I'm walking back and forth to the kitchen, or I'm walking into a supermarket and I'm just buying a load of food. I'm almost in a trance. So this is why I think, one, talking about it and reducing the stigma, hearing other people's stories, connecting with other people who have been there. You see people's shoulders like almost dropping because I run groups. I'm a big fan of group work for this kind of thing because there's so much that shifts emotionally from being with other people and getting support. Everyone wants to jump into what's the behavior I have to do? Let me just change my behavior. But you've been trying to change this through changing your behavior for however long. And then, of course, the next piece would be to look at restriction. And I'll pass the baton to Stefanie.
Well, that was my inroad. So I had a lot of I wouldn't say a lot of compassion for my emotional self, but I understood at some point that I was being really hard on myself, but it wasn't enough to change it. And when I was talking about, the nervous system sense of homeostasis and what it's trying to do essentially, and you use the word stuff, safety, that's what it's looking for. It's looking for this, it's trying to make everything safe. But the brain, on the other hand, is also saying what you want, nervous system, is not safe, because I live in a world where there's a lot of pressure to look a certain way, and I might face discrimination if I let my body grow. And I'm not okay with that. That's not safety to me. So we've got this conflict between what's safe in our body and what's safe in our minds and in the social world. And I had to appeal to that first, because even though I was starting to understand what was going on in my body, I was reading books like The Fuck It Diet by Caroline Dooner. She was one of the first people that introduced this to me. And I started to get that. But I was like, yeah, but how do I manage that on the outside? And Steph, you recently had a post that said something like, if you are becoming uncomfortable, discomfort is a signal that you're sort of getting closer to what you want. And I started to understand, I'm not going to feel safe doing this. It's going to create discomfort because of these kind of opposing needs. So establishing safety inside of myself was one of the first things. I think I didn't name it that at the time, but it was kind of what I had to do to say, I had to accept that I would become uncomfortable and that I needed to know what my resources were. I needed to have support. I needed to feel safe enough to say, when I become uncomfortable doing this, I'll still be okay. And that can be a privilege sometimes. I mean, I relied on my husband, who was supportive of me gaining weight, to do that and to know that even though I'm going to feel this pushback in the world, I have safe places. I didn't have a group at the time, but I did have a coach, who was helping me with my body image, and that was a safe place. So we do have to consider the safety of other parts of us besides the nervous system that are competing with the safety of the nervous system in order to feel ready enough, I think, to take that on, because it will be uncomfortable and it will feel unsafe to some degree. And I say to some degree with intent, because if it's too unsafe, it becomes traumatic. And then recovery becomes, I think we become more hopeless when we try it and we feel completely overwhelmed with it. It's not feeling safe at all. And then we're like, I can't recover. I'm worse off now than when I started, because now I think I can't even do it. So that's important too, is to understand the level of safety we have and to build that through support and through connection and through education of what's going on, so that the shame's not also further convincing us of our lack of safety in order to start. So there's a lot of readiness involved in getting there.
I'll just mention this for my listeners so they can link the dot together. My safety was a lot built on understanding the system behind it. So that's where my lens with a feminist mindset came from. That's how I created safety, by understanding the history, the anthropology, the sociology behind why I wanted to be thin.
Yeah.
And that for me was safety.
I agree.
Can I just ask you quick?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question, if that was okay, Stefanie. When you were making this mind switch, was there some anger when you realized these pressures that you've been living under? And that, I think, is a great piece of it, because when we put our anger outwards, when our anger goes inwards, it goes to shame, right? And there's something so protective about anger that's like, no. And so I just wanted to name that piece, because so many people, especially people socialized as women, have a really hard time with anger. I think they make them a bad person or something.
And I hope we're going to have time, but that's where the pendulum swing for me completely the other way, right? And I know, Steph, you had a post recently called Permitter versus Restrictor. And for me, I went in permitting everything, which is part of healing restriction, but I got stuck there. Mm-hmm. Because combine that with the anger at the system, I got stuck in, I don't know how to name it without making it wrong, but I got stuck there, not feeling good because I was eating too much of the things that weren't making me feel good. I'd like to talk about that. Do you see that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I see that a lot. And people then who get stuck in the permitter place, they feel like they've been gaslighted by this message of just don't restrict and you'll swing and you'll come back. Because like you say, it's exactly that. It's a pendulum. At some point, we need to find our way back to middle, but there's a momentum that goes. So often we need to swing and we need to go into that place for a bit. And then it's finding our way back. Because when we look at it all as systemic, we have no power at all. We've lost all our personal power completely. But before, we were trying to take too much personal power. We were trying to take on more things than were actually ours. So it's about learning how to take a bit of that back without going into this shame place. Well, if I find my personal power, that means that I should be able to do this and I should be able to do that. And I sometimes talk about it as it's a dance between freedom and order. Look, that's the healthy place, that throughout life, we want a freedom and order little dance. What happens is order starts to pick a fight with freedom. It wants to control. So order gets a bit too big for its boots. And then freedom goes into chaos. Now you're fighting between control and chaos. So what we want to do is to come back in. So when people get stuck in permitter, sometimes they're so frightened of order because they think it means they'll lose their freedom. So the question is then, how do I bring a little bit of order in, a little bit of rhythm to my eating? Like all these, the gentle nutrition principle of intuitive eating is brilliant at this point as well. And doing a bit of emotional and psychological work around some of the fears that might be there.
Can we talk about compassion and the role of compassion when you are in that swing, when you are aware of that compulsion and not judging yourself for it?
For me, after I gave up trying to lose weight, my binging calmed down in terms of severity, but I was still having episodes of compulsive eating because I was living in this. It was like this perpetual state of shame, really, of just kind of feeling not good enough, a bit defeated, because I knew that if I tried to diet, this was where it was going to go. And so then food became a way to numb out. Like I just wanted to escape for a bit. And sometimes people talk about this as well. Use food as a way to escape. If I had an empty afternoon, the thought of being alone in my own mind with nothing to do was unbearable. It's still uncomfortable now. I want to say that but it was unbearable at that time. So I used to use food quite a bit to escape myself. So the compassion piece was really giving myself that bit of a break and going, even though this, or even though that, I'm okay. I started to notice this pressure that I was putting on myself. I was stuck in this place where anytime anything went wrong, I would blame myself. I'd be like, oh, I should have done it differently. But anytime anything went right, I was like, oh, thank you, universe. I've been so lucky. And there was this real kind of mismanagement. I was taking responsibility for anything that wasn't doing well or good enough. And I was giving myself zero credit. And that I noticed was really out of balance, and bringing that, the recognition of that helped to bring it into balance a bit more as well.
I also think there's different types of compassion, and one being more gentle and one being more fierce. And Kristen Neff talks about the fierce self-compassion. She wrote a book with that title, which really spoke to me because, and again, when we're talking about permitters and restrictors, I think generally with restrictors, there's a sense of the fierce sometimes. Like it's that, it's just more aggressive a little bit and has more of this, no, it sets up boundaries really well. But with the permitters, there's more of the gentle, like passive, a little bit like more soft, happening. And I think, but we need both. And sometimes there's an imbalance of fierce to gentle and gentle to fierce. I was a binge restrictor, so I had more of a sense of, I didn't have gentle. Gentle wasn't part of my comfort zone. So, I knew how to tell myself what to do and like how to hold boundaries, but I didn't know how to soften. And softening was important for becoming flexible along that pendulum. Whereas, some of the clients I work with who are more permitters have a hard time with fierce and with having boundaries that aren't meant to control and over control. And so looking at fierce and gentle through the lens of compassion is understanding that it's okay to say, order might be all right. Like order might be safe. That might help us feel more, safe, like that enclosed sense of space without running into extreme ways of thinking and rigidity. But gentle might also be helpful for the softening around all the expectations we have and protect us from over order, right? So like for me, cultivating these voices, and I still had to cultivate the fierce a little bit too, in a way that wasn't so fierce, that wasn't like, trying to dominate. And figuring that out too. But I think that fierce self-compassion can be something not thought about when we're talking about compassion. We tend to think about it as more nurture. And some people just don't relate to that. And it can feel too soft, and it can feel like you're letting yourself get away with something. And I think that there's still a place for having a little bit more like, no, it's okay. It's kind of like the mama bear who's like, look, I'm here to protect you. And we need to have some boundaries in place so that we know that you're going to stay safe, but also to know when she's not maybe the one to look towards, and we need to have some more like compassion in the more classic definition of that. So there's an art between the two.
I'd never heard of the fierce concept, but I connected with that because when we talk about safety, my path to safety was compassion in almost a fierce way. Like I had to dedicate myself for a year to engage in compassionate behavior. Like it was so foreign to me that it was a commitment of just every time I felt anxiety in my body, for me it was around my chest and my rib cage and my diaphragm, I had to lay in my bed and hold myself like a child. And the more I did it, the more I wanted to do it, the more I faced many parts of my life with that, I want to call it that fierce compassion. And that's when it made the compulsion okay to have. And quote unquote, magically, the compulsion went down because all my body wanted was compassion. So by giving it, I no longer needed the nail biting and the binging because I was able to comfort myself. Does that make sense to both of you?
Yeah. And also it's interesting because did you say you went into your bed and held yourself like a child?
That's my thing.
Yeah. So my bed is my thing, but I have such a different, like I had to be fierce with myself to say, it is okay. And with this kind of firmness, like it's okay for you to go in bed and to hide from the world for a little while. Cause I had shame about that. I'm like, why do you need that? I was like, isn't that depression? Like, that's not okay to need that, to need more alone time, to be an introvert. So there was this fierce part of me that came in to say, stop shaming yourself for that, and to be really firm about it. And like, enough of this self-criticism. We need to get in bed. Our body is screaming for it. Allow it. It's okay. And just that, and I listen to a voice like that. I'll listen to something that sounds like they know what they're talking about. And that angle in was so much more effective than the voice of like, come on, let yourself get in bed, just do, because to me, I felt like, but I'm always doing that. Like I needed someone to really tell me it was okay and to really feel strongly about that. And I relied on that strength. That's how I think about the fierce.
Did you want to add anything, Sarah?
I thought it was interesting, yours, Stefanie, because it sounded really gentle to me. You talk about like getting into, the getting into bed and holding yourself like a child. It felt really gentle when you were saying it, but the fierce resonated with you. So I was curious about it. I didn't know whether to ask, but I was curious about that.
No, absolutely. And I'll talk about it. Like, in order for me to get to my bed and be gentle and compassionate, for me was holding myself and using all my various somatic, tactile tools. I had to get a coach. And I had to get a somatic coach that told me it was okay for me to do it. And then to stop the session, and I would go in bed with her in my ear pods, and she had to guide me to do it. And for like 3 months, every session was about how I felt ashamed, like Steph said, for not being able to push through, and I should be able to push through. And it wasn't easy and gentle. Like it took a lot of dedicated, quote unquote, pushing myself to do it. In order to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was so foreign. But that was my way to safety. And that was my way to, and I want to say this, like, I wasn't working towards stopping binge eating. I was working towards making myself safe. Because the more I was working just on solving binge eating, the less it worked. Is when I gave up binge eating, and I'm like, we got to fix what's underneath it. Not fix, but modulate what's underneath it. That's when the binge compulsive started to slow down and erase themselves naturally. Do you see the same thing?
Yeah, I think you speak to something so important there, because I see people getting caught in this loop of they try to stop binge eating by trying to stop binge eating.
Yeah.
Like that's the focus. I'm stopping. When really we're going, okay, what is it we need to be looking at instead that is then less compatible with binge eating? What is it you need to try and create for yourself? And the more we focus on the thing we're trying to stop, we just end up like in a fight with it continuously. So that shift onto something else, I think, is a really important point. So I'm glad you shared that, Stefanie.
And it takes support. Like for me, I would have not been able to make that shift without support, help, therapists, coaches, like all the tools, because it was 25-year pattern coded in my brain. Mm-hmm. Like I had to have someone holding my hand through that. So if anybody listening to that, they're like, it's me and you've been trying, perhaps it is time to get one of us or someone else to hold your hand. And the power in that, that's what will, to me, I don't want to say fast track to make it sound like it's going to be easy, but that's what's going to get you on the other side of the struggle.
Yeah.
That's what you guys do. So let's talk about how you've helped people in closing that podcast.
Well, what you're talking about is how I built my coaching practice, because when I was going through this, I was like, if I ever make it, I wanted to shout it from the rooftops, and when my binging started to reduce, I was like, I couldn't believe it. It was just like, what, me? Like, this is impossible. And I was like, I just want to hold, and that is the term in my mind. Like, I want to hold people's hand through that. So the way that I set up my coaching practice is to have Zoom meetings, as much coaching exists around. And that's more for like deep diving into bigger themes that are coming up. but I also do WhatsApp coaching in between so that you have someone to talk to every single day. You eat every single day. And this comes up every single day. It's completely pervasive. So to have someone to anchor to every day and to find that safety, I think it is a sense of safety to co-regulate with another human who gets it and who's not going to carry that shame any further for you, and just going to sort of be that pillar of just a place to vent or a place to offer a different lens or to challenge something in a safe way. To have that consistency, I think is really important, because I remember feeling like every day I wanted to go run back in the other direction. And I really would have benefited from having someone to help. And I did use some people to sort of help me stay and to help me stay with myself, essentially. And I think we do need that until we learn that ourselves, and then we can keep moving.
Steph and I often talk about the idea of readiness when someone gets to the point where they're thinking, and really believing, I want peace, like more than anything. And I'm willing to give up this idea, or even try and figure out if I can give up this idea that there's only one way to get it, and that is through trying to do it the way that I'm doing it. And it was interesting because I only saw this a couple of weeks ago on my YouTube analytics. 45% of people who watch my YouTube channel are aged over 55. That's nearly half of the people are aged over 55. And I think it's because a lot of the way I talk about it when I'm talking about these concepts like surrendering, there are many younger people who get it intellectually, but until it's enough of a lived experience, if someone had told me like early on when I was struggling with this is what it's going to take for you to recover, I'd have gone, no, thank you. No, thank you. I need to just make sure. Right. And so then I'm meeting these people in their 50s and 60s, and they're saying, I was doing that for decades. They're also saying, oh, if only I heard this message earlier, like if only there were people doing what you were doing earlier. And maybe not. I'd like to think now that younger people who are struggling with this hear the message sooner and might get to that place of readiness sooner. So sometimes I might be working with someone who's still in it, and I'm holding their hand when they're in it, and I'm just trying to help them understand and see what's going on, because I could say something and they could cognitively agree with me that that's what's going on for them. But until they see it in an embodied way, it won't shift enough for them to really feel like it's possible to do it another way.
So I just want to be sure, like you work in a therapy format where people can explore their trauma, because for me that was essential. Like I had a therapist early on where I was able to put on the table the traumatic parts of my life, and we were able to unpack it. And that was part of me being able to create safety.
Yes. Exactly that. So sometimes people will come to me for therapy around the food, and we end up rarely talking about the food, like you were saying in your coaching as well. So sometimes therapists will say to me, don't you get fed up with working with the same thing all the time? I'm like, no, because you work with everything, because everything's connected to everything.
Yeah.
And I also run groups, and I also do workshops, and I do monthly support meetings as well. And Steph and I have a support community that we do monthly calls for and on Facebook. So that's a huge fact. Like I'm really passionate about bringing people together who struggle with this, because most people who struggle with it don't have anyone in their life who really gets it. Even if they have some support, there's no one that really gets it. And the first time they get to connect with people who get it, it's like, wow. So even though they rationally know they're not the only one, when they're in it, you feel like you're the only one. It really feels like the loneliest problem to have.
When you get into group, you realize that you're not the problem. Like when you hear like people listening to this podcast, they're like, you think it's not me the problem? Like you think there's other people? And I remember for me, when I realized there was other people, it was like a 100-pound weight that dropped off my shoulder. Because this whole 25 years, I thought I was alone. And all of a sudden, there was more people struggling with me. So it helped me see that I wasn't the problem.
Yeah. It also helps with the compassion piece, because when you're listening to someone else saying, and it feels like this is exactly what goes on for me, you feel that compassion for them and you see yourself in them at the same time. The group starts to act as a bit of a mirror and can help start to shift. It's not instantaneous for most people, but it starts to build that capacity to feel that self-compassion for yourself and your struggle.
It was a beautiful conversation. Thank you very much for sharing these 45 minutes with me and with my listener. I know it's going to help a number of women having conversation from that angle, and as many angles I can explore, the more people I can help. So thank you very much for having this conversation.
Stefanie.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Hey, my sisters, if you are loving what you are learning on the podcast, you have to come and check out our feminist mentorship masterclasses and our internationally recognized non-diet coaching certification on our website at www.stefaniedotze.com/shop. This is where you can get the individual coaching and the support to take the concept taught on the podcast to the next level, embrace our well-being in a way that will expand our collective freedom and power. Come and join myself and other women to learn how to reshape your mind, not your body. I'll see you there.